And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. My honor today to have on Paul Smith from Citizens Impact there in the state of Georgia. Paul, how are you today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Well, today we want to talk about a couple of topics. One really being the importance of persistence in public life. And Paul's an amazing example of that. And we've talked about that some in recent episodes. You think about Dobbs overturning Roe versus Wade, 50 years. You think about the clarification of the Johnson Amendment, 70 years. And I certainly like, microwaving popcorn and it happening in just a few minutes. And we've joked before, if you do student ministry and you watch Gen Z try to microwave popcorn, I laugh with them about how it's just taking so long. And so we definitely live in that very fast-paced, quick expectation type of environment. Whereas sometimes the hard, good work that's done in the public square just takes time. And Paul's a great example of that. I also wanted to dig in some to Christian education and then specifically the work that Paul's doing there in the state of Georgia. So looking forward to that. I'll mention just a little bit of Paul's bio. We'll jump right in. Citizen Impact's founder, Paul Smith, has been involved in public policy work since 1996, advocating on behalf of Christian education as well as moral and religious liberty issues. Prior to that, he was a youth pastor and a pastor. In 2009, he founded Citizen Impact as a response to the direction of American culture and political environment. He's dedicated to being a full-time advocate for these issues and speaks in churches, schools, and community groups on how regular citizens can make an impact in this area. Paul, if you would just dive in, if there's anything critical you think that I might have missed in your bio, but I was interested just in a recent success story. Just one, as we dive in, what is just a recent event where God moved in your ministry?
Yeah, I appreciate that opportunity. And I suppose the only thing I might add in the bio is just that I never thought I would do a ministry like this. I studied for the ministry, was a Bible major, felt called to full-time ministry, called to preach, just intended to serve on a church staff somewhere. And as you referenced in the bio, I did those things, serving in a traditional church staff role in a couple of different churches. And um, it's just what I thought I would always do. And the Lord had other plans for me and other opportunities. And I had to change my thinking about that and recognize that God can use someone who's called to ministry in public policy work. It has to be done as a ministry. And so that's where our heart is. I try to distinguish our organization from other Christian advocacy organizations that are doing a great job, and there's nothing wrong with their model. But we're a little different, and I like to think of us more as a helps ministry to churches, and people in churches will understand that terminology where we're not just advocating for legislation, although we do that, but we are also a resource and someplace churches can turn to when they're just dealing with the government. And a recent example of that is a church and Christian school in Georgia. Their principal actually called me, reached out to me, and told me that their county sent them a property tax bill for their preschool building. And the thinking of the government entity was Georgia law says you're exempt from property tax if you're a house of worship and you don't worship in the Christian preschool. In fact, it's a business that you charge people to use. And so he called me and told me that. I said, do not pay that bill. Don't pay that tax bill. You need to fight this tax bill. And he dug down and learned the process to appeal that. And through a series of meetings and other things, including hiring a local attorney there in his county who knew many of the people involved in local government, they were able to prevail and have that tax bill removed. And a step we took in that is contacting Georgia's uh, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee in our state General Assembly and we had a sit down meeting with him, with the pastor, the Christian school principal, and we discussed whether something needed to be done in the Georgia tax code to address it. Ultimately, we felt like that probably wasn't needed, that this was a one off, if you will. But I said to this legislator, who's the chairman of a very important committee here in Georgia, do you really think that the government here in Georgia wants to start deciding whether or not little children quoting Bible verses and singing Jesus loves me in their Christian preschool is worship or not? And we kind of laughed. He said, "No, Paul, we do not want to start deciding that kind of thing." I said, I didn't think so. And so we were able to help that ministry through that kind of difficult ordeal and obviously unexpected.
That's an excellent example. And one way that I see our ministry, you say you're helps to churches, but sometimes you're also helping the government official
Mhm.
understand, how a church operates and the fact that, yeah, this isn't just your run of the mill preschool, that you're teaching them scripture, that it's a ministry
Mhm.
of the church. So I found that to be part of our work as well, of sometimes having to educate that governing official. And so you can bring real value there. And I was just thinking, what a great model for determining effective legislation, not just kind of let's come up with some idea, and we often have almost 1,200 bills proposed here, but actual real like boots on the ground need translating into a public policy proposal. So what an amazing example, and I'm grateful you were able to serve that church.
Well, and if I
So
could
we talked a
elaborate a
little
little
bit.
bit,
Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, on your other point. So we have sat down with the heads of the department here in Georgia that licenses the preschools, and I've done just what you described. Had to educate them on what we do in our Christian preschools and how the government offers free preschool right down the road, but people choose to put their children in our preschools that they have to pay for because they want a Christian environment. And we talked about how they really aren't in a position. Let me clarify. They're certainly in a position to protect the children and look at fire codes and other safety concerns. But in terms of evaluating how our teachers teach or what curriculum they use and things like that, they're just not in a position to do that. And with these elected officials, many of whom, certainly here in Georgia, I would say the major majority claim to be Bible believing Christians who are members of a church, but we're discipling them, is how I say it. That helping them understand this is how you apply the Bible to what you're doing. Here's the biblical worldview perspective of the issue that you're voting on. Sometimes they're receptive to that. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they even get angry with you when you try to talk to them in those terms. But we absolutely have to educate and disciple these government officials.
I love that you're framing it that way, because one of the reasons we started the Good Citizen Project, and I joined the effort here in Indiana as well, is many churches do a good job of discipling their folks to be, a good mom, dad, employer, employee, school teacher, engineer. But then what about public life? And if the church does not disciple people in that role, somebody's going to do it. and I think it should be the church, discipling those folks. And so I'm grateful that you frame it that way and that you're doing that good work. You mentioned this call from serving in a pastoral role into public square ministry, and that was kind of a paradigm shift for you. Would you dig into that some? I love catching people's stories about how they are called into this space.
Well, I guess the way the Lord began helping me with this is I was asked by a pastor to help their church to develop their youth program, and this was a church that had been planted about 3 years before. They were in no position to pay any kind of additional staff, but they had the goal and the desire to grow and to add staff. And so I began to help just in a completely voluntary role with the youth ministry at this church. And then the Lord opened up an opportunity for me to work for the South Carolina Association of Christian Schools. My thinking at the time was, well, I can work for this Christian ministry while I serve as a youth pastor, and within maybe a couple of years, the church will be able to hire me on staff there. Well, that wasn't God's plan. I ended up working for the South Carolina Association of Christian Schools for 7 years, and the church really never got to the point of being able to add any staff. But during those 7 years, I wore many hats, but one of those was legislative director. And I would go to Washington, D.C., and this, of course, is a state affiliate of the American Association of Christian Schools. I would go to Washington, D.C., two, three, sometimes four times a year, advocating on behalf of Christian schools, which, by the way, your audience should know that's primarily religious freedom. It's not primarily trying to get vouchers or other money from the government. It's primarily just leave us alone, let us operate according to our sincerely held religious beliefs. But during that time, in also working on the state level at South Carolina State House, I remember someone saying to me, in fact, two different people saying to me, you seem to have a knack for this kind of work. And I'm like, oh, no, no, no. This is just necessary evil. I'm called to full-time ministry, not to, lobbying or that kind of work. So that was my mindset at the time. But during that time, I think this is an important part of my story. During that time, I would attend the American Association of Christian Schools National Legislative Conference every September. And in September of 2001, we were invited by the new George W. Bush administration to come to the White House for a briefing by White House staff. And that meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. on the morning of 9/11.
Oh,
So
wow.
we were showing up at the White House, and a few in our group of about 140, I think, were there for this briefing. Few of them had actually gotten through security when they began to evacuate the White House. And we were told to get away from the White House, and we didn't know what was going on. Your younger audience might not think about the days before smartphones, where you had news instantaneously at your fingertips. Most of us had no idea what was going on. But we moved away from the White House. In fact, crossed the street, and a security person, either police officer or White House staff, yelled at us to get even further away. So we moved down the street, down the sidewalk, further away, and as the Lord would have it, a man was parked on the curb with his door open, playing his radio, just turned up loud, but opened his door so that people on the sidewalk, mainly us, could hear. Now, it wasn't the whole group. The group scattered in many different directions, but there's probably, I don't know, 25 of us that huddled around that door listening to the news of what was happening and trying to get our minds wrapped around what was going on in our country at that point. Well, finally, someone in the group of pastors and Christian school leaders from all across America said, we should pray. Yeah, that's a good idea. And we formed little impromptu prayer circles there on the sidewalk. I think there was maybe three circles huddled around, about to bow our heads and pray when White House staff, who themselves were just scurrying to get away from the White House, stopped and said to us, "Can we pray with you?" And we said, "Oh, certainly." I mean, these are people with lanyards around the neck with their White House ID. And we welcomed them into our little prayer circle there and prayed with them. They were
Wow.
clearly upset and bothered by all this. Well, that's kind of neat in and of itself that we had that opportunity. But a year later, 2002, we go back to the White House for a briefing. It wasn't the 1 year anniversary, it was the day before, September 10th, 2002. And we had a very long and pretty neat briefing for political nerds like me. It was really cool to hear from people that I'd only seen on TV. And finally, at the very end, they put the presidential seal on the podium. And sure enough, George W. Bush came out and said to our group of from ACS, I know you missed coming to the White House last year because of the terrible events of 9/11,
Hmm.
but it was important to me to come out here and thank you for being a help and a comfort to my staff on that
Oh,
terrible
wow.
morning. Yeah, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. At the
Wow.
time, I think I
Good
had
story.
goosebumps on my goosebumps, realizing that here's the President of the United States, the one everyone calls the most powerful man in the world, took time out of his schedule to thank us because he heard that we were praying with his staff and providing comfort to them. And the Lord put a seed in me that year that there are people in government who need the Lord, who need spiritual help and have spiritual needs. And so that's always been an important part of our ministry is remembering that the folks that we're dealing with and their staff and even other lobbyists and things all are spiritual beings and have some spiritual need, whether it's salvation or other things. And so we try to keep that as the overarching philosophy behind our ministry that there is something more important than how they vote, on a bill, and that's where they're going to spend eternity. And we never want to be an obstacle to them coming to the Lord. Now, just to finish my story, uh, again through the providence of God, I ended up moving to Georgia to come to work for the Georgia Association of Christian Schools, another AACS affiliate. That gave me I quickly became their legislative director in addition to the other hats I was wearing. And the Lord just used that to help me to get contacts, both legislatively as well as ministries that would support citizen impact, to lay the foundation for for this organization and this ministry. So, 2009, my wife and I just began to pray about it. We were challenged by a godly deacon at our church, who's an attorney, to pray about, whether God couldn't use us in the government sphere. And so I made that commitment. We decided to do that in August of 9, and then August of 10, just took the step to do it full time. Leave the Georgia Association of Christian Schools with regular salary and benefits and just go full time with this ministry, which is quite a step of faith. We, on August 1st of 2010, we did not have the first monthly support check coming from any place. So
Wow.
it was quite a step of faith. But I'm happy to report that there are 78 churches in Georgia that are financial supporters of our ministry.
Well, well, there's so many points I could follow up on there. One, I just appreciate your trust in the Lord, your faith to say, I'm going to launch out here and do what God's called us to do. That can be unnerving, I think, for any Christian. It's just trusting the Lord there. But what an incredible story about ministering to the White House staff. I've never heard of that from anyone else that may have been there. I think I know a few folks around AACS. And so what an incredible story. And something we think about all the time is how can we minister to the person and then minister to the official as a partner with the church for the common good. But it's just incredible when you stop looking at them only as the letter behind their name or what they can do for you. And some of the most intense, spiritual conversations I've had are with people that are completely ideologically opposed to much of what I would promote, and yet they just got an issue in their family and they just start bawling. And so I so appreciate that reminder to us, people first, and then the rest, policy, partnership after that. But I am wondering if maybe for those that are going into public life, there should be an internship at least in youth ministry, because that's also part of my story. And there is just something to going, and I would joke about like, oh, I was in federal court earlier today, and now I'm dodging whoopee cushions, and it does something to keep you humble, I
Keep you
think, and
grounded,
and
yeah.
I,
Well,
that's
and
right.
that background also is why we use our ministry to impact the next generation. So we have student legislative days at the General Assembly for high school juniors and seniors, and no doubt my background with teenagers is part of why I'm burdened to do that. We at
That's
our
right.
August conference will have workshops for students that they can attend that, and we have offered internships to college students in the past, and we even offer a college scholarship to uh, college student, undergraduate students. So we're trying to keep those roads and open to the that younger generation and the streams of communication with them because they're tough to get to pay attention to what's happening in public policy.
It's so important to be pouring into that next generation. So listeners have heard us mention AACS, American Association of Christian Schools, several times. Many are probably familiar, but essentially, not exclusively, but largely church-affiliated Christian schools that have come together to say, hey, we want to be able to educate our kids in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. You've described a good bit of your work with them previously, but my understanding is you still are doing some work with them. Would you describe that? Maybe one or two issues that have been top of mind in that work?
Yeah, I continue to help advocate for the Georgia Association of Christian Schools and consider their legislative director. It's not a paid position, not a position on their staff, but we advocate for them. And then the American Association of Christian Schools considers me their South Region legislative director. So that covers Georgia and South Carolina. So I really would say it's important to note that we really, I don't think could have much of an impact on the federal level if it wasn't for the American Association of Christian Schools because they're in Washington D.C. every day. Their office is on Capitol Hill, in fact. So they're tracking this legislation and they're doing all the legwork. And then we'll go up there a couple of times a year and set up meetings with our congressmen, and the AACS is who prepares us for that. They'll send us the talking points of the bills they're tracking and prepare us that way. So I have to give them credit. Most ministries, I think, like ours on the state level, don't do a whole lot in Washington because either one is a full-time job, right? So it'd be hard to do
Sure.
both. We're partly able to do that. Again, to be fair, full disclosure, the Georgia General Assembly is only 40 days. So they're January through end of March, first part of April. And so we don't go to Washington during that time. It's after that, usually April or maybe beginning of May is our first trip up there. Um, but yeah, the AACS is a critical part of us being able to track that and influence that. You asked about recent things that we worked on. Um, One of them had to do with the 2017 tax cuts, what's commonly referred to as the Trump tax cuts, and how the raising of the standard deduction for taxpayers, which was a good thing. It increased, I think, double for most people. The unintended consequence was that it disincentivized charitable giving because now people didn't need to itemize, so they weren't incentivized to make charitable contributions. We lobbied to help uh, tweak that a little bit so that people who make charitable contributions but who take the standard deduction um, can still claim some of their charitable contributions. So that was important to do that. That had to be renewed and to keep that option on our taxes. But the one big beautiful bill, as it was called, included some school choice provisions, and this would apply to states that are just never going to pass school choice on the state level. Now, here in Georgia,
Sure.
we do have school choice options. We have education savings account. We have tuition tax credit programs, things like that, where people are incentivized to give to a student scholarship organization through tax credits. The Georgia Promise Scholarship is actually state money that would follow a student. And even on the state level, as well as on the federal level, our primary concern is protecting the religious freedom of Christian schools who choose to participate in these school choice programs. So we both levels we're trying to communicate to these legislators. Look, we're grateful that you're willing to vote to for vouchers or whatever they might call it, but we're not willing to do that at the expense of uh, our sincerely held religious beliefs, our biblical foundation of our schools. We sometimes will use, depending on the audience, the Bible term for money and say, where there's shekels, there's shackles. So we have to be very careful about that. And so I find myself, uh, in fact, in many cases, my role is to, on the one hand, look at legislators and people in public policy and explain, the biblical worldview and why we need the things that we need and the way they need to vote, but then turning to our Christians and Christian schools and churches and explaining to them the other side of it. Like, you Christian schools, we're protecting you, but something could change that would force you to choose between accepting this program or violating your biblical standards. So it's a tricky balance to educate on both sides.
Yeah.
But we're very grateful for the American Association of Christian Schools and the fantastic work they do in Washington.
Well, and I do enjoy at times that kind of role as translator. And I'll be sitting there with, say, somebody from the Department of Child Services and a pastor. And of course, in the church, we have our acronyms and our Christianese, and so they'll say something. The DCS workers looking at me like, "What in the world?" And like, well, here's what they meant. And then of course, government has its acronyms,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
they
Yeah.
say something. I'm like, no, here's what they meant. So you get to play that role of translator in this
Yeah.
work. That's always fun. Well, I want to pivot a bit to how you're engaging churches. So, what specifically, you mentioned you have a number of supporters. What are some of the challenges, but also opportunities in engaging the church?
Well, this is another way that I believe that we're distinct from other Christian public policy organizations, advocacy organizations. Um, when I was praying about starting this ministry, in fact, I don't think I even had a name at the time, but it occurred to me that I would need to start contacting pastors. So I wondered how many pastors in Georgia already knew me, that I could call them and they would know who I was. So I just took a legal pad out, no contact list or, Rolodex for the older crowd would know what a Rolodex is. No contacts on my phone. Just sat down with a legal pad. How many pastors, if I call them, they know who I am? And I wrote 40 names down, and I thought, oh, that's a pretty good start. That's not bad. And of course, that was who I did first start contacting, and I made just a concerted effort to contact pastors if need be 5, 6, 7 times to ask them, can I present at your church? Can I explain to your folks what we do? Can I have an opportunity to preach and challenge them uh, to look at what's happening in our government through the lens of Scripture? And the Lord just paved the way. I mean, there's no question it was of the Lord because I was able to get quite a few pastors on board fairly soon, starting this ministry. And I'll speak to it from a human standpoint. The fact that I had no other source of income. The people in commission sales say you have to starve into it. Well, there was some of that for us where we were certainly trusting the Lord to meet our needs. I mean, not George Mueller praying in breakfast for my children, that kind of thing, but we had a house payment and a car payment, and our kids were in Christian school, and so we had to trust the Lord to provide those things. But as a result, we have a fairly extensive network. I have preached in over 200 churches here in Georgia. I have about 400 on my pastor's email list. and we've been able to create a network that didn't exist. I have a very good friend who's the government affairs liaison for the Georgia Baptist, the Southern Baptist here in Georgia. They have a network already in place, but um, our churches, primarily independent Baptist churches, don't have a network like that. So we've been able to build that network and just help pastors as they navigate this area because it's on everybody's mind. What's happening in government, what's happening, um, that their people are coming to them and asking them about. One of the biggest challenges is to get them to focus on state level politics versus national politics. I think it was the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, back in the 70s or 80s, who said all politics is local, trying to get the members of Congress to think back home in their districts. But that's almost done a 180 where all politics is national now almost. And so if someone's running for state house, I would even venture that running for county commissioner, people are going to want to know, do you support Trump or what's your position on abortion? And county commissioner is going to be, I'm not going to vote on that. I'm not going to, but it's all national. People are watching national news and following national things. And so to get them to focus and understand, hey, the Georgia General Assembly is going to introduce 1,200 bills, and the governor is probably going to sign 300 of those this year. So we need to be paying attention to what's happening in your backyard more so. Now, what Congress does may be fewer and far between. It often can be more impactful when they finally do act, but there's a lot more to keep up with on the state level. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges is helping these pastors get to know their state house member, their state senator, and build relationships with them. And if you don't mind me saying so, I think our ministry will have that legacy that we helped pastors who didn't know who their state house and state senator was to get to know them, to text them, to have the legislator text the pastor and say, "Preacher, would you pray for me today? I've got an important committee meeting," or that kind of thing. So we I felt like we've been somewhat successful with that.
And again, just one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, I am encouraging Christians to invert their political attention. As you mentioned, DC matters, and sending
Mm,
notes to your congressman, congresswoman matters. Doing the work that AECS and others are doing matters. But for most Christians, we're going to have our greatest impact to our own zip code, and I'm sure listeners are getting a little tired of me saying that, but I'll keep saying it. And even where we've seen the Supreme Court go, that a lot of the energy is coming back to the states, and so it's a much easier opportunity for pastors to pastor their community. To know that state senator, that state rep. We had a really fun opportunity this last session. There's a pastor from Southern Indiana, and his state rep goes to his church, but he had never just it just isn't done right. So it's not that he was lacking as a great pastor. It just never kind of crossed his mind to come up to the state house to see where his state rep and member works. And my understanding, this state rep is a man of fairly few words. And on Sunday, when he came back, his wife came up, and I think the mother-in-law came up, and they were just thanking the pastor for coming and ministering to him. And that's just missed opportunity if ministries like yours aren't on the ground doing that. So again, that kind of church-led, state-based strategy, I think there's so much opportunity for us these days. Well, I wanted to, as we kind of wind down here, wanted to pivot to the story of a measure that you supported for my understanding 10 years. And we talked about persistence in public life and how we want to just get things done really fast. So maybe would you tell some of that story? And you have this great line that you talk about how or when Christians quit in public life. And so please dig in and tell us about RIFRA in
yeah,
Georgia.
yeah. So this legislation required an awful lot of teaching and explaining to people in our churches why it's needed and necessary. And it goes back to a Supreme Court decision, I think about 1990, Smith versus Employment Division. I'm no attorney, so I don't want to try to pass myself off as one, but it changed the standard or how the government would look at religious freedom issues. And so Congress acted fairly quickly. And in 1993, led by Chuck Schumer, who was a House member, Jerry Nadler, also one of the co-sponsors, and signed into law by Bill Clinton, who made it actually a very tremendous statement on the need to protect religious freedom in our country and they enacted the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, restoring the twofold test that government must apply if they pass a law that restricts religious freedom. And so there's many examples of this, but they, in other freedoms, they have to meet this twofold test. It, is it a compelling government interest, and is it the least restrictive way to satisfy that government interest? I don't know if this is a good example, but I say our freedom of speech is limited because we cannot yell fire in a crowded auditorium, right? Because the government has a compelling interest to silence that speech, right? I don't think you can threaten to kill the president of the United States, right? Sometimes the government acts and says, your freedoms are limited, and here's why. You have a freedom to assemble, but not in the middle of the interstate and block traffic. So if those things are challenged, the government has to meet that test. Well, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act restored that for that freedom, religious freedom. But in 97, Supreme Court ruled and said, well, this only applies to actions by the federal government. To have that same freedom restored for religious liberties on the state level, states are going to need to pass their own version of RFRA. And so states began to do that. In fact, one of the most interesting parts of this is in 1998, Illinois uh, enacted a state level RFRA. And every member of the Illinois Senate, 100%, voted to enact this RFRA, including a young, relatively unknown senator named Barack Obama, who was a member of the state Senate at the time. And so I often would bring that up. Connecticut and other places have enacted this, but Georgia has not. So in 2014, it was first introduced, so actually a little more than 10 years ago. But at the same time, in the news, there were stories about the Christian baker and florist who would not participate in the same sex ceremony and use their skills and artistic abilities to do that. And so RIFRA became a way of addressing that. So that complicated RIFRA from what it had originally been in the 90s. So that created a lot of opposition for this legislation. And the governor at the time of Georgia he actually vetoed a religious uh, freedom bill that included RFRA. So there wasn't much stomach in the General Assembly to work on it when they had a governor who already vetoed it. But we got a new governor and we got new members of the General Assembly. And a year or two ago, this bill was introduced again. One of the change in the climate was, you know, 30 some states have enacted a RFRA, and we had not seen anything in the last 10 years where RFRA had been used as an excuse to discriminate against anyone or, anyone prevailed in court in not serving someone or that kind of thing. So there wasn't much of an argument that RFRA was going to do that. So that helped us. I think maybe on a side note, culture overall has kind of taken a turn on the LGBT issue. Now, that's a whole nother discussion, but that's changed a little bit as well. But anyway, we were able to work on that this legislative session. We have an event at the Capitol every year, our Pastors and Ministry Leaders Day. I think we had about 150 come to the Capitol from all over Georgia, and they talked to their legislators about this. They and told them why it was needed and necessary. But I had to spend really the last 10 years in churches explaining it, explaining what it did and didn't do. I mentioned my friend with the Georgia Baptist. He was doing the same thing with their churches, kind of explaining why we should support this and why it is beneficial. And so all of that worked together to finally get this passed without a lot of external opposition. When it was first introduced in 14 and 15, people showed up to protest at the Capitol. There was none of that this time around. So there was still opposition from Democrat leaders, but by and large, it wasn't too controversial this time to get it passed.
So you mentioned about 10 years ago the blow up over RIFRA, and Indiana may have had a little something to do with do with that
You
at some
absolutely
point.
did. Yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah,
apologies for that. And
yeah,
essentially,
yeah.
listeners probably familiar Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Paul, you did an amazing job describing that. One way I kind of think of it is levels of judicial scrutiny. And if,
Mhm.
when a religious liberty violation comes to court, the judge just kind of eyeballs it, it's like, it's all right, versus having to pull out the judicial microscope and ratchet that thing down and say, oh, is
Mhm.
this a compelling interest? Is it narrowly tailored? It's just all the difference in the world in a religious liberty case, and that's all it was. But then the other side drummed up that this is going to be used to discriminate against individuals, and it just took on a life of its own. It caused
Mhm.
severe problems here, and then I think it scared off a lot of people around the country. But
Mhm.
then, yes, over those 10 intervening years, we've seen a change, maybe a cultural change, a shift in momentum. And I just think sometimes of in life, you really try to push things forward at a particular time, but God just has a different plan. And then when it's time, it just happens. It's just like
Mhm.
it, the
Right.
door opens and boom, boom, it's done. And so I love that, here it is, all this effort, and then it's done.
Yeah.
Kim signed it,
Well,
it's on the books.
and you mentioned my quote about Christians and involvement. I don't know who to accurately attribute the quote to, but someone said many years ago about Christians getting involved in advocacy work or lobbying their government officials that when we lose, we quit and go home, and when we win, we quit and go home. And unfortunately, there's a
Yeah.
lot of truth to that. We just want things done instantaneously. And when it doesn't work that way, we just throw up our hands. Or, we get one thing done and think, well, we just won the Super Bowl, so now we don't need to do anything else. Well, no, there's the other season, next season's about to start, and we need to be
Yeah.
back at it. So, yeah, to stay at it and to keep doing it. Now, I do think it's important to note that, our pastors in our network who support our ministry, who come to our pastors day, they will tell you we want to keep the main thing. And your question about I think you're about to ask about the billboard. That's something that I thought about. We want to keep the main thing the main thing. It's the gospel. It's the Great
Sure.
Commission. It's discipling people. The hope for America is not in getting a bill passed or getting a politician elected to office. The hope for America is in the gospel. And I really think it's the church repenting. In Second Chronicles 7:14. That's what will heal our land is God's people repenting, turning from our wicked ways. But that doesn't mean that bills and elections are unimportant, but they're not the number one most important thing.
Well, one way I think of our ministries is, kind of keeping the door open for the gospel, and that government in its proper role maintains order so that the church can fulfill the Great Commission. And if government gets off of its right path, that can cause some major distraction, like the the case you described of, oh boy, I have to pay property taxes for my preschool. And so it's a important ministry. Paul, you kind of took that question out of my mouth, and what an important reminder on that billboard of keeping the main thing the main thing. Well, I've
Mm.
covered a number of topics. Before we go, is there anything that perhaps you would like to share with the audience that maybe I didn't get to?
Well, I just want to say that our ministry, our organization is certainly unique, and we're grateful for God's direction and the success we've seen. Our pastors and ministry leaders day, the governor speaks every year at that event, recognizing the influence of our organization. But we also do our annual conference, which is coming up next month. I don't know if any of your audience would be in the vicinity of Georgia and be able to attend the conference, but you, of course, are our keynote speaker for that event on August 21st. We're looking forward to that. We will have uh, a legislators panel where legislators will be there to take questions. And we have workshops for pastors and for students and others in the afternoon. And it's a good event to help Christians get equipped to know how they can make an impact, how they can be salt and light while still maintaining the important role of Christians as being disciplers and uh, people who follow the Great Commission, presenting the gospel and making that the most important thing, but understanding what else we can do to be that salt and light.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to being there with you and sharing, but also just as I travel the country, learning from Christians in different areas of just how public square ministry is being done. So I'm certainly looking forward to that. And so, Paul, thank you for your example of just following the Lord where He's called you and your persistence in public life. And thank you so much for taking some time to be with us today.
Well, thank you. It's been a privilege to participate in your podcast.